It's not a stretch to say that LEGO Castle is one of the most popular themes that LEGO has ever produced. The blocky nature of LEGO lends itself very nicely, I think, to the building of blocky castles, and the minifigure knights and soldiers allow for a suitable platform for medieval fantasy adventure. Throughout the years, we have had many LEGO Castle factions in the grand tapestry of LEGO Castle. Some of them are a lot more beloved than others, though. At the very top, we have factions like the Black Falcons and Green Dragons, and these regularly top lists of everyone's favorite faction. There's even one channel on YouTube dedicated entirely to the collection of a Black Falcon army. Even the Raven Knights, a faction comprised of ostensibly just one official minifigure, the CMF Tournament Knight, are popular enough that entire armies are made out of them, and I remind you, there's just a single CMF. But not all LEGO Castle factions are created equal. In a theme that is as big as it is long-running, LEGO Castle has a lot of factions that I feel have fallen by the wayside. In today's video, I am going to be attempting to defend a LEGO Castle faction that I feel has become something of a joke in the LEGO Castle community. Of course, who else could I be talking about other than the Rogue Knights? At the mention of Rogue Knights, some of the more casual LEGO fans must be a little confused. After all, LEGO Castle does have a bandit faction. They're called the Wolf Pack, and they're having a sort of small renaissance with the new Wolfpack torsos on Pick-a-Brick, and of course, rumors of a Wolfpack CMF in 2025. No, I'm not talking about the Wolfpack. They're bandits through and through, and although they're very interesting, they're not actually the subject of today's video. The Rogue Knights are exactly what they say on the tin. They're rogues and they're knights, and their genesis goes to a time in LEGO Castle that some, I think, wish hadn't existed, namely, Knights Kingdom 2. Video games weren't the first instance where people would just reuse the same name for a different product launch in a different year. Knights Kingdom 2004 is actually the second Knights Kingdom sub-theme by LEGO. The first one, in 2000, has absolutely nothing to do with this one. I'll be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of Knights Kingdom 2 when it came out. I have much fonder memories of the original Knights Kingdom than I do its successor. I think for me, the thing that really put me off was the emphasis on the huge action figure-like Bionicles-inspired knights that actually made up Knights Kingdom 2. My interest in LEGO Castle has always primarily been in the building of castles, and I felt like that range didn't really cover that correctly. So, I have to admit, but as the years have gone by, I do think that some of the derision that fans met that sub-theme with was maybe exaggerated or unmerited. For better or for worse, Knights Kingdom 2 was a genuine attempt to try and build something different for LEGO Castle. I don't think it ended up necessarily succeeding, but I think it was a genuine attempt to try, and for that I think it deserves some praise. I do recommend the series by Cheesy Studios for a more in-depth review of the sub-theme and the sets that comprised it. I also want to highlight Mike Rayhawk's brilliant blog on Knights Kingdom. In addition to some truly amazing art, I found a lot of interesting information there about Knights Kingdom 2, and I think it's highly worthwhile if you're interested in the subject. In this video, I'm going to primarily focus on the Rogue Knights, why they're not so well liked, and try to offer some counter-arguments for you to chew on. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, if I've changed your mind, or maybe if you're the number one Rogue Knights hater. So, in order to explain exactly what the Rogue Knights are, I think we need to talk about Knights Kingdom 2. So Knights Kingdom 2 basically consisted of a series of sets from 2004 to 2006. The Rogue Knights only appeared in 3 of these sets in 2006, towards the end of the lifespan of the theme. To understand why they showed up, I think it's important to understand the story of Knights Kingdom 2 in detail. So Knights Kingdom 2 takes place in a fictional fantasy kingdom called Morcia. There is a king, Matthias, who disappears mysteriously, and his not so suspiciously named advisor, Vladek, assumes the throne in his absence. Now, with a name like Vladek and red and black armor, this guy couldn't be more obviously evil if he tried. Vladek basically disappeared the king and assumed the throne, and the story of the first wave of Knights Kingdom 2 is largely about 4 knights, Jaco, Santis, Raskus, and Danju, who are trying to stop Vladek and find the king. Spoiler alert, they succeed, and Vladek is forced to flee to a neighboring kingdom of Ancoria to try and retake the throne by force. In the second wave, Matthias and his 4 knights are basically trying to defeat Vladek inside of his evil fortress, while Vladek is basically sitting around doing some other stuff, building a magical artifact called the Golden Shield, standard evil bad guy stuff. Our focus, however, of course, is on the final wave of sets. This, unusually, takes place years after Vladek has been defeated in the second wave. Jaco is now the king of Morcia, peace has returned to the land, and everything is supposedly fine and dandy. The now King Jaco, who is hoping to reforge the Golden Shield and secure the realm, sends out his two new knights, Kentis and Elric, to find the blacksmith who can reforge the shield. Unbeknownst to them, however, Vladek has secured an army of rogue knights in secret to also find this blacksmith and reforge the Golden Shield for himself. So, that I think is a fairly condensed summary of the story of Knights Kingdom 2. It's not Shakespeare or Lord of the Rings, but I think compared to LEGO's usual minimalist storytelling, it's actually quite interesting to see something that has an evolving storyline. If you really got into this series, I think you might be able to sink your teeth into something much more substantial than the kinds of things that are usually made for children, especially around this time. But, of course, the question you might be asking is, why did Vladek need the Rogue Knights? Well, for the first wave of sets, Vladek's army was comprised of the very cool-sounding Shadow Knights. These guys with their red-black armor and scorpion logo are very obviously evil, but they're super cool. They couldn't look more sinister if they tried, but boy do they really look cool. But these guys are not just your standard bad guy henchmen. What makes them more interesting, I think, is that the Shadow Knights are actually all once loyal knights of Morcia, but they've been twisted with dark magic to be Vladek's mindless servants. Even when Vladek fled to Ancoria, he again used dark magic to basically mind control presumably good knights and turn them evil. However, after his two previous failures, Vladek finally had to resort to the Rogue Knights instead, and that of course gives us our three sets that have them. Okay, so I've beaten around the bush for long enough. To put it simply, I think we need to talk about why people don't like them. I think the main reason why the Rogue Knights are hated, or maybe perhaps disliked is a better word, is simply their color scheme. I think there's a reason why the Rogue Knights are sometimes referred to as the Naked Knights, and it's because their color scheme is the same yellow as the yellow that is used for LEGO body parts. Thus, when you look at them, I think it is very possible for somebody to think that these guys are in fact either naked or wearing something like loincloths, armor, and nothing else. I also think it doesn't really help that they came at the end of Knights Kingdom 2. Given what came before, if you were a fan of the Shadow Knights, you probably wouldn't like the Rogue Knights and how they deviated significantly from Vladek's previous sinister minions. That is, of course, if you like Knights Kingdom 2 in the first place. I think a lot of things go wrong for the Rogue Knights because the deck is kind of stacked against them. So I'm going to do my best to try and argue otherwise. I like the Rogue Knights. I actually think they're probably one of my favorite castle factions, at least in concept. And I think people forget how things used to be with LEGO, especially because I think a lot of people judge them by today's standards for minis. So I've broken down my arguments into a bunch of different sections, and you can skip around if you like. So I think if we're going to do any kind of defense for the Rogue Knights, I think we have to start with their color. I certainly don't want to argue that no one could think that these knights were naked. They do in fact use basically the same color for the heads and flesh and bodies, and I think that would definitely give somebody the impression that they're not wearing clothes. However, I think it's important to consider some context for the times. Firstly, this is 2006. It was only 3 years before, in 2003, that LEGO first introduced naturalistic, flesh-colored tones for minifigs. Since then, the rule has generally been that licensed properties, that is, outside of the LEGO group, make use of naturalistic skin tones, and in-house LEGO themes use the original LEGO yellow. So for example, if you're wondering why the characters on Marvel's LEGO's Avengers are having natural skin tones, well, that's because they're Marvel properties, not LEGO properties. So even if flesh tones were widely available, and they weren't, it would have been extremely unlikely that LEGO would break their internal rules for a sub-faction within a sub-theme with just 3 sets. I think it's much more likely that if we're going to critique the Rogue Knights for how they look, it's important to understand that they were always going to have the yellow color that we normally associate with LEGO minifigs. For the record, I think the Rogue Knights look more or less fine as they are. I don't necessarily think of them as being naked, and I certainly like the color scheme. And also, I think for the record, I also think that if you wanted to, you could just swap the Rogue Knights to have flesh-colored heads, and I think that would be a perfectly legitimate way to represent them. I would go so far as to argue that doing so would probably eliminate most of the issues that people have with their colors. We can do it now, quite easily, but certainly it wouldn't have been easy back then. I think the other problem with these figures is really a problem that all figures have in the range. When it comes to minifigure design, specifically for Knights Kingdom 2, figures don't really have arm and leg printing. The most amount of printing that you can get will be on torsos, but more commonly breastplates. If anything stands out to me, stylistically, it's the heavy use of breastplate printing in Knights Kingdom 2. And that kind of breastplate printing really isn't that common these days. I mean, just look at all the main 4 knights. Each of these guys has a unique printed breastplate in a unique color to them, right? That's just not something that you're going to see, oftentimes, especially with modern LEGO breastplates. Unfortunately for the Rogue Knights, they did not release in 2020 like the Tournament Knight CMF, which has amazing leg and torso printing, and I think that really sells the idea that the Tournament Knight is wearing medieval knightly garb. In the absence of that printing, it's up to your imagination to really fill in the blanks about what these knights are wearing. Are they wearing cloth gambesons and tabards and things like that just so happen to look like their skin color? I think so, but that's not necessarily going to be everybody's perception of them, right? I think it's a matter of subjectivity. I don't think it's necessarily fair to argue that nobody could see it that way, but I also don't think it's fair to pretend that everybody thinks of them maybe as being naked. And I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the Rogue Knights either that they ended up with the unfortunate color association. I don't think anyone would have really complained if they had been some printing on the legs to make it clear that it was part of the armor, but of course, I digress. The thing is, in real life, a lot of people do wear clothing that matches their skin color, and of course, in our perception of the human world, we can look at somebody who has brown skin wearing brown clothing and think of that person as, okay, they're just wearing brown clothing and they have brown skin. There's nothing really weird about that. It's not as if it makes them look naked. The problem is LEGO minifigures don't have that level of detail, so it's entirely up to their level of printing and probably their parts construction and color choice to give you the impression of what it is that they're wearing. If we're dealing with like LEGO civilian clothing, they can print on a pair of jeans and have that look like a pair of jeans. But when we're talking especially about these early days, and especially about armor, I think that's much more difficult to have expected. Yes, I think it's an unfortunate association, but I don't think yellow is a bad color to choose for knights, especially because yellow is a color that is very much associated with knights throughout history, and I think the idea that not putting them in yellow would have been a bit strange, right? The other thing that I want to talk about is that I've seen some people talk about how it would have basically fixed the problem if LEGO had released the Rogue Knights in bright light orange instead of yellow. I disagree with this point. Firstly, bright light orange did actually exist at the time. It is a color that is not as old as the original LEGO yellow, but it definitely was around for the 2000s. But I disagree that using it probably would have made the situation necessarily better. I don't think, for example, if they had switched to bright light orange, we would have had many LEGO Rogue Knight fans to this day. I don't accept that argument necessarily. So using this amazing reference that is created by Ryan Howiter, I can compare bright light orange and the LEGO yellow to each other. In this particular comparison, delta E is the variable that basically tells us the difference between our two colors as represented by hex codes. So for example, the delta E between black and white presumably is 100, indicating that it is a huge difference between these two colors. And that makes sense. Black and white are exactly opposite to one another on the color spectrum. A value between 1 and 2 is just about a perceptible difference, I think, in the human eye. Some people might not even have the color sensitivity to even see that necessarily. So generally speaking, values above 2 are generally much more recognizable as being different colors. Do you want to know what the delta E is between our LEGO yellow and bright light orange? It's about 10. Now 10 is hardly a massive leap forward. Yes, I do think the color is perceptible. I can certainly see the difference between these two colors. However, they are very similar. They are very similar in various different ways, and I think that under different lighting conditions, the similarities become even more pronounced. So I don't think that the differences between these two colors is really that much more pronounced. I think the reason why the Tournament Knight CMF really shines, why people like it, is because it has a lot of additional printing. It has a perfect color scheme married to a perfect level of printing that really sells you on the idea that you are looking at a LEGO medieval knight. That, I think, is the reason why the CMF Raven Knight or Tournament Knight is just so well beloved today. And I don't think it's because there is a slight difference between the color of his head and the color of his armor. So yeah, I think the main problem is that the scheme itself was very limited. It was limited in the sense that the range itself didn't have the option for a lot of leg printing or arm printing or anything like that. It was limited by the stylistic conventions of the Knight's Kingdom theme, right? I see that a lot of people don't necessarily complain about the color schemes of, for example, the other knights, or the Kingdom of Mercia, or heck, even Vladric and his minions, right? I think that their red and black color scheme is really, really nice. However, our Rogue Knights, with their ostensibly black and yellow color scheme, which should, I would argue, be a classic, is not given that same level of detail, basically I would argue for largely trivial reasons. I think if we're going to be fair to the Rogue Knights, I think we just have to accept that they were in a time when LEGO wasn't necessarily at their best when it came to printing, mini construction, and a bunch of other things. I think there was a heavy emphasis on selling the large Bionicle type knights and those types of characters, and I feel like the minifigures did suffer quite significantly. Although, to be fair, again, if you are an off-the-market collector and you're looking for things like off-color breastplates, well, Knights Kingdom 2 basically has you covered. Another criticism of the Rogue Knights, I think, is that they're an unnecessary addition to the lore of Knights Kingdom 2. So, moving past the colors, I think if we're going to get into the weeds about Knights Kingdom 2, we're probably going to be talking to people who already like the faction and the setting and so on and so forth. So, we have Vladek, who had very cool and appropriate Shadow Knights, and I think a question that we have to try and answer is, why did they drop them? Now, I don't have insider LEGO information, really, but I do think the question can be answered actually in lore. I think it's a fair point. I do love the design of the Shadow Knights, and I do like their lore as a faction. I think it's an interesting idea that you have these legions of knights who were once good, but then turned evil, and now they're fighting for Vladek, and he's kind of a hybrid between an evil wizard and an evil knight, and I think the Shadow Knights combine those two ideas perfectly, where you have knights and their conventional regalia and so on and so forth, but then they're magically controlled. I think that's really cool. I feel that this argument ignores one of the main pillars of Knights Kingdom 2, namely the story. So, by the third wave, Vladek had been defeated not once, but twice. Both times had been significant disasters for him. I think, if anything, his Shadow Knights proved that they were ultimately incapable of meeting the real challenges that Vladek faced as a conqueror. I think that the Knights of Morcia proved that they were much more capable of defeating Vladek than he had maybe realized, and when his second plan fell apart, I think that's where you need to think about your evil villain plan. Vladek had tried twice, and he had failed twice. Repeating the same strategy years later, I think that feels a little bit ridiculous. The first two waves of Knights Kingdom 2 were much more closely aligned in the timeline than the third wave, which was meant to be much later. I mean, after all, Jacob is the king. So personally, I think it makes much more sense for Vladek to reflect, to think. He tried shadow magic, it didn't work out. Maybe the act of dominating the willpower of knights who are not necessarily loyal to his cause, maybe that makes them less capable soldiers in the end. Perhaps that's why the 4 Morcian knights were actually always able to defeat him. Maybe instead of trying to dominate his subjects to try and win power, maybe he just needed people who would fight for him on their own free will. Vladek had suffered major defeats as well. We can't forget that, right? He can't just go about trying to win in the same way. While he's certainly not above trying to use force again, I do think Vladek probably realizes that by the time of his third attempt for the throne, he has far fewer resources than he had, and that his situation is actually probably a little bit more desperate. Enter, of course, the Rogue Knights. The Rogue Knights are not, as far as I can tell, mind-controlled. They're led by 2 warlords, Dracus and Karzon. Now these are 2 men who are not mind-controlled puppets of Vladek, but rather they're self-motivated and self-directed. They're his lackeys, in effect. But they have their own minds. They're far more cunning and ruthless than I think you might give them credit for, and they don't necessarily have to receive direct orders from Vladek, as mind control servants would have to. So interestingly enough, these 2 men are also the reason why the Rogue Knights have 2 different color schemes. The vast majority of the Rogue Knights work for Dracus, and he is somebody who wears yellow and black and has a dragon symbol, and so the Rogue Knights wear yellow and black with dragon shields. Some of the Rogue Knights, however, work for Karzon, and Karzon wears blue, so those Rogue Knights wear blue with the snake symbol. I don't think it helped the Rogue Knights that most of their minifigures were in yellow as opposed to sand blue, but that's life sometimes. If you know more about the inner workings of LEGO production at that time, please let me know. I'd love to hear it. But I actually kind of like this flexibility. I think it makes the Rogue Knights feel like actual mercenaries. They're not brainwashed, they're in it for themselves. They have their own individuality, right? And that allows them to style themselves after their leaders. I think that's interesting, right? They're not brainwashed, they're in it for themselves in the way that mercenaries often are. I think that these kinds of soldiers probably might necessarily attract some of the rougher elements of society, the outcasts, the exiles, the dispossessed. Former knights, especially, who might want to join up in the fight against Morcia on their own free will. I think it also means that technically, your Rogue Knights could probably be whatever you want them to be. If we imagine that Vladek had many more different mercenary captains of Rogue Knights, I think that each would be led by a different leader, And then I think in theory you could pick your own colors for that leader, and then have those rogue knights under that leader be a different color. That's a uniquely flexible faction in a way that I think that a lot of LEGO Castle factions are not. The sub-theme, unfortunately, was never meant to last, and I think the Rogue Knights were never expanded upon, so we don't necessarily have their full potential for a faction. And I don't think, of course, LEGO had any interest in exploring that further. I think by the time 2006 rolled around, I think the writing was on the wall regarding the Rogue Knights. And, that's really unfortunate. But I do think their lore actually fits where Vladik is at the story at this point, and also I think it makes a lot more sense for the story that they were trying to tell in that third wave of sets. Okay, so I think I've made my case to you about the Rogue Knights. You've heard my arguments. I hope you've maybe done a bit of thinking, and perhaps maybe I've changed your mind just a little bit, just a smidge. This channel is, of course, called Hardly Heroic, and I would definitely say that the Rogue Knights qualify. To me, the Rogue Knights represent an interesting potential outcome. In a lot of LEGO Castle themes, the two main factions are often very binary in their morality. You've got good guys, usually in blue, and bad guys, usually in red. When I was younger, that sort of thing definitely appealed to me, but as I've aged, I find I want to engage in more nuanced storytelling. To me, the Rogue Knights are a missed opportunity in the wider LEGO Castle community. They're not good guys. Yes, I mean they work for Vladik, but they're not straight up evil either. I see them as sort of a middle ground. They're mercenaries. They serve whoever pays them, and that's sort of the end of that. I think that some of their members might be a lot more honorable than the baseline, and some of them much less so, but there's a lot of flexibility and freedom here. I think that Shadow Knights implies a level of evil that I don't think can really be separated from who the Shadow Knights are. But in the same way that I think that a lot of people regard the Wolfpack as sometimes fighting heroically against the tyranny of monarchs, I think that the Rogue Knights could easily fulfill that sort of niche as well. They're not just bandits, they're knights. They're actually a lot more like the Golden Company from A Song of Ice and Fire, being, of course, in my mind, comprised of exiled nobles, outcasts, and the like, as opposed to the more common bandits that you probably would find in the Wolfpack. I think that this gives the Rogue Knights a very interesting place, because yeah, I don't think they're necessarily all evil. They might have some evil masters, and they might serve an evil cause, but I don't think you could imagine them as completely evil. I could imagine that, say for example, Vladik is defeated again, and he's scattered, perhaps imprisoned or whatever, and then the Rogue Knights just go about their business trying to find their next contract, trying to find their next master, right? I think that's really interesting, because oftentimes in LEGO Castle factions, the entire faction is either good or evil, right? With the Knights of Morcia, they're all basically good, and with Vladik's side, at least in the first two waves, they're all basically evil, except for, of course, the fact that the Shadow Knights are only evil because of mind control. I think having something like the Rogue Knights, where they're not necessarily evil, they're just serving an evil master, adds a lot of moral complexity that I really actually enjoy, right? I think it really is interesting to think about this as an expanded option in terms of LEGO, right? And the final reason why I like them is probably the silliest. Basically, one of my favorite factions in Warcraft 3 are the bandits. I've always enjoyed seeing bandits in most games, and I really enjoy the way that the bandits are presented in Warcraft 3, actually. Kind of makes me wish that there was a dedicated bandit campaign. But, my favorite unit of all time, pretty much in Warcraft 3, is the Bandit Lord, aka the Bandit Knight. As somebody who has always found the trappings of knighthood interesting, but not necessarily the feudal obligations, I think the Bandit Knight is probably the coolest unit in the game, and I've loved the model, and whenever I think of that guy, I always think of the Rogue Knights, and yeah, don't you just think that's cool as well? I bet you didn't think I'd find a way to talk about Warcraft 3 in a video about LEGO, huh? Well, that's hardly heroic for you. So, in closing, I hope that I've offered you a new perspective on a much disdained LEGO Castle faction. I think that, I might be one of the few vocal defenders of the Rogue Knights. I will definitely plant my flag in the camp of the Rogue Knights. I think that, especially with the benefits of modern design, the Rogue Knights could easily be one of the top tier factions, especially because they use a color that's really not very represented in the LEGO Castle canon at all, right? They make use of yellow, which is ironic because, of course, when I think of LEGO, I think of yellow first and foremost, because that's the color of LEGO people. They are, I think, a faction that I enjoy talking about. One day, if I can get the disposable income, I'd like to make an army of LEGO Rogue Knights, maybe to expand upon them, to build them in the way that I think that they should be. So, that brings us to the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. It's definitely something that's been on my mind for a while now, and I do actually want to make more LEGO Castle videos. This is not, of course, going to become a LEGO Castle channel. I think there are other better channels like Goldfire for that, but, I do love LEGO, and I definitely will be talking about it some more. So, feel free to suggest any LEGO-related topics that you like. Remember to like and subscribe and, all that stuff. Until next time, goodbye.